one of the very first things that President Donald Trump did when he took office was to sign an executive order that he says was protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. He said it's the policy of the United States that it will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called transition of a child from one sex to another. And it will rigorously enforce all laws that prohibit or limit these destructive and life-altering procedures. So we said at the time when we covered that, because obviously those things are happening in Washington state, I would say we're kind of ground zero for the radical gender ideology and the acceptance of, taking these drastic measures with a young child's life. There's a lot of things that a kid can do even without parental consent in Washington state. We have the mature minor doctrine, which means even if a parent won't consent to gender transition surgery, if you could find one doctor in progressive Seattle, for instance, that'll call you a mature minor, you can have some life-altering surgeries to change or try to change the appearance of your body to identify as a different gender. So, the Trump administration, with what it did, it basically said that the tool it was going to use to try to force hospitals to stop performing these procedures was monetary. They were basically saying, we're not going to fund it in any way. So if you're a medical institution and you get federal grants and you're providing transition surgeries for minors, we're not going to give you any more money. And so we had said, maybe that will force the hand of even the most extremist policies for hospitals in a place like Seattle. Well, it now appears that it has. And I have to say, this is some of the best news I have heard in a really long time. And all these common sense things that are happening, this fear that they wouldn't happen here because, we have, I called Washington state the resistance, and there's all these ways that the state can continue to do things absent what the federal government wants it to do. So The Stranger published this story today. Seattle Children's postpones trans teens surgery indefinitely. And I saw that and I thought, oh my gosh, thank God. Thank God. So The Stranger publishes this, of course, as a sob story, which we'll get to in a moment. It says, according to the family of this trans teen, hospital staff called their 16-year-old son on Monday evening and explained that the hospital had postponed his surgery in accordance with Trump's executive order banning all federal support for gender-affirming care for trans people under the age of 19. The Stranger went on to say, the family says they were told during a meeting with surgical center staff Tuesday morning that if the hospital lost access to those federal funds, other children's care would be at risk. And the decision was made with the entire community's interest in mind. So there you have it. President Donald Trump's executive order is successful, even in a place like Seattle, even at Seattle Children's, which I would call in Washington state the lead butcher of young kids, enforcing their hand on this, because if they lose money, as they allegedly stated to this family from the federal government, then it puts the lives and the health of other children. I mean, Seattle Children's Hospital, don't get me wrong, they do some wonderful work. I know people whose children have been saved thanks to the medical professionals at Seattle Children's Hospital, which of course made it all the worse that they were also engaged in these life-altering surgeries for kids who wanted to be a different gender and whose parents were actively encouraging it in many cases. And so I'm glad, I guess, that Seattle Children's, which has made some of these really horrible decisions, realize that, hey, we cannot put other kids at risk, who have cancer or whatever it is, by violating or pushing back against Donald Trump's executive order. And The Stranger says they reached out to Seattle Children's multiple times for comment. Seattle Children's would not comment on what they told this teen or this teen's family, but the article is pretty extensive in explaining sort of what Seattle Children's is going to have to do moving forward. Now, what is the surgery, you might be asking? Because this Stranger story, as much as it's a sob story for, oh my gosh, these trans youth, it actually exposes how horrendous some of the things that have been happening at Seattle Children's Hospital are. So for that, I'm grateful. This is a passage that explains it. So it says, just after 5 p.m. yesterday, the surgery department called Ethan, a trans teen, and said his masculinizing chest reconstruction surgery had been postponed on account of the order. The sudden cancellation was exactly what Ethan feared when he read the executive order, but hospital staff had assured him the procedure he'd waited years for would proceed as planned. Allow me to tell you what a masculinizing chest reconstruction surgery is. Ethan is not a boy, Ethan's a girl. And this hospital, Seattle Children's Hospital, was going to cut off her breasts so that this 16-year-old girl could feel more masculine. That's how far gone the left has become in radical gender ideology. So for anyone who says, oh, that kind of stuff isn't happening, we're talking more about gender hormone therapy and all this stuff, or puberty blockers, which are both bad anyway. No, this 16-year-old who the stranger just calls like a boy. No, it's a girl. It's a 16-year-old girl, and Seattle Children's was this close to cutting off their breasts had President Donald Trump not intervened with his executive order. Thank you, Mr. President. I mean, how horrifying is that? And the extent to which, I was laughing about this a little bit this morning, but it's actually insane. The extent to which the stranger paints this as like the worst thing ever, and literally Donald Trump is Hitler for preventing, in this case, a 16-year-old girl from getting her healthy breasts chopped off. So the stranger talks at length to this 16-year-old girl's parents, who are obviously fully in support of the surgery that, and again, may I remind you, it says the hospital staff had assured him the procedure he'd waited years for would proceed as planned. 16-year-old girl waited years to get her breast cut off? You have to wonder what kind of indoctrination is going on at home. But when you read the article, you understand that this is clearly something that these parents actively supported, so much so that they tell the stranger they're going to leave the country, flee the country, because in the U.S. their 16-year-old girl can't get her breast cut off. Here's a passage. I'll just read the whole thing to you. So Sarah's the mom's name. Sarah says the only reason she exists is that her Jewish grandfather left Germany in 1933, the year Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Ethan's dad, Mark, says despite his U.S. public school education, he absorbed the same lesson as his wife. The dad says it was clear in 2022 that if Trump got elected, things would get very bad very fast. He says if we had the privilege and the ability to get out, we should. The wife chimes in. Under an ideal circumstance, I would stay and spend my life on the resistance. But I am disabled, and I have a trans child who is also disabled. He's right, we should get out, Sarah says. And Mark says, that doesn't mean we're not fighting. It means we're putting on our mask first. So you have these two parents. Oh my God, can you even imagine this household? These two parents literally comparing they say they're going to flee the U.S. so their 16-year-old girl can cut off her breast somewhere else. They're comparing that to her grandfather fleeing Nazi Germany. And parents like that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Donald Trump's executive order was necessary. So there's no mistaking it. Donald Trump in Seattle, and this is just the one example, I'm sure of many, made it so that a young girl who's clearly brainwashed by her parents, a young girl who is this close to cutting off her breasts, cannot have that surgery done. I mean, it's so significant. And we have so much of this happening in Washington state. So that's your answer, right? As to whether these medical institutions would push back against the Trump administration, would be willing to give up their federal funding. If even Seattle Children's Hospital is not willing to give up its federal funding because of the impact it would have on other patients and their ability to provide care in other arenas, I can't imagine that other hospitals aren't going to do the same thing. This is very good news. It's very good news. And I will say we're still TBD whether the Attorney General in Washington state is going to sue over this executive order. When we had checked in with Attorney General Nick Brown's office when the executive order was signed, they sent us kind of a vague statement just saying our office is reviewing the order and how it may impact Washingtonians. We may have more to add later. Now, I think it's probably pretty likely that they try to sue over this, especially now that you have instances coming out of trans teens. I mean, this whole stranger article saying that it's basically painting this as life or death, that you have to cut off a 16-year-old girl's breasts. Like that's a life or death situation. It's harming people. It's not. It's just insane. But to see that, I guess, in The Stranger and to hear that news in one of the most progressive cities in America, their hand being forced by Donald Trump to stop this mutilation of children is the best news I think we've had in a very, very long time. And I always say when I talk about this issue, I always talk about my regret for supporting a parent's right to choose whether their kids go through these procedures. And I've talked about this a lot in the past. I'm not afraid to admit when I've changed my mind, but I think, I'm so in favor of parental rights that I got a little blinded to this, that if a parent wants to consent to a child having one of these life-changing surgeries, then who am I to say that they shouldn't? But at the end of the day, there's a lot of medical procedures that are banned. There's a lot of medical procedures historically that we look back on in horror. And I think these are going to be some of them. And so, I changed my mind on it in the not too distant past. And clearly, there's going to have to be some changes to the way what hospitals provide. And hopefully that's permanent. I can only hope that it's permanent and that we're never going to go back to this place, because in 10 years, maybe not even that long, we will look back at this period of time in the country in horror.